So what does work when we want to support that cyclic consumer to make progress? Well, one of the things that's most important is for us to have realistic expectations, and we touched on that a little bit in the last video. People are not like cars. They don't go in and get fixed so that overnight they're 100% better. Normally the strategies that we apply take time to have an impact, and it's normal for us to have some examples of relapse or regression. So what we need is to have a trend toward improvement, and that trend can sometimes be subtle if we don't have a longitudinal view of that person. If they're new to us or they're only in our lives for a short period of time, then we may wrongly assume that that person is worsening or at a critical point, when to others who know them well, this might actually represent some improvement. So we often don't know the background or context for the person, and this is one of the reasons why it's important for us to be involved in a community-based team with people who might have some continuity, and also so that we can provide continuity to others. Now take a look at this graph. Here are the graph scores for somebody whose initials are BB from June 2011 until March of 2013. And you can see that the yellow line represents each point of contact with their clinician where they were assessed for their GAF, their Global Assessment of Functioning. If you recall all the way back to Module 1, is the score from 1 to 100 that reflects that person's mental health. Now this person was at a 70 when they first came in, and that's pretty good, but they declined all the way to a 50 in the month afterwards, or a few months afterwards, and then they gradually progressed. Now if you were working with this individual, you might assume if you met them here or even here that they were at a situation of steady decline and that they were worsening. But if we look at this red line, it shows that the trend is clearly an indicator that the individual is actually improving. They are having higher lows. In other words, their crises are not nearly as low as they once were. Here's a 65 compared to a 50. And you can see that they're not lasting as long. This person came back up rather quickly here, whereas when you look here, the person took a far longer time, and same here, to take a far longer time to return up to a higher amount. And finally, you can see that in terms of their healthy state, they've increased slightly as well, although in this case only by a score of about 2 or 3. Still, overall, this individual is spending more time being in a healthy state, less time being in a unhealthy state, and they are trending towards improvement. And so it's important for us to recognize that this is an individual whose strategies are working, and we don't want to necessarily change them dramatically. There may be some adjustments, there may need to be always some developmental changes as we go through a process like this, but we don't want to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater thinking that this individual is not getting better. This is why it is so important for people to stay connected to that consumer and hopefully to do good and effective record keeping and to share records as much as confidentiality rules will allow us to do. We need to make sure that the treatment approach that we take is an integrated treatment. Now, earlier in our course, we've talked about it being a comprehensive approach, and that's quite similar to what we're talking about here with an integrated treatment. In the old days, the terminology we had was of a serial approach to helping people. They would go and see one professional and then presumably would be better after seeing that professional, for example, for their physical health and welfare, and then they might go and see somebody for psychiatric adjustment and get some kind of medications, and then after they were stable on medications, they might go and see a psychologist or a counselor to help deal with their psychosocial needs, and so on and so forth. Well, the problem with that serial approach was that many people simply did not get to the second or third stages in the process because the services that they were receiving one at a time were not weighty enough, didn't have the mass behind them enough to actually create the change that was necessary. When we combined services, we're far more likely to be effective. And so this was the second approach that began to be taken, and it was called a parallel approach. The parallel approach suggests that one professional is working with you at the same time as another, and or maybe multiple professionals. However, the difficulty with the parallel approach was that these professionals were normally working alongside of each other without consultation and collaboration. They often didn't know what one another were doing, and sometimes were either creating redundancies or were actually working at odds with each other. And so we have finally ended up with this third approach, which is why we're talking about having a new systems terminology. The new system that we need is to have an integrated treatment approach. But we must understand that sometimes we do need to take things in a step-by-step fashion, so the serial approach is not completely abandoned either. And neither is the parallel approach that we might need, for example, to have people who are doing disparate things at the same time. What's important is for us to have communication and have a plan so that we are managing all of those things effectively and in a connected way. And we need to not forget, and this is our second point here, to have psychosocial supports so that we aren't just focusing on medical and physical things like medication, sleep, exercise, and food. All of those things are incredibly important, and we do want to have them in there, but we also want the psychosocial elements. For example, is this person lonely and disconnected from others? Does this person lack activities that help them to gain a healthy identity, such as being involved in a productive or creative hobby? Do they have a connection to a spiritual activity, something that gives them a way of answering some of the bigger questions they have in their life and to cope with some of the things that are more stressful than they might otherwise manage? Are they a member of a larger community where people will see if they're in crisis, or where people can help them where, for example, they're in need? Maybe with a ride or with some money or with somebody to watch their children while they go to a doctor's appointment. Do they have a connection to their family and friends, and do they have good social and coping skills for dealing with the dynamics within their family or friend circles? Again, we aren't all in love with everybody in our lives. Sometimes we have family connected to us, but that isn't necessarily a really happy and healthy dynamic. And so one of the psychosocial supports that people sometimes need is social skills training. And that can be through a counselor, that can be through a course, that can be through something like an anger management program. But we want to, again, try to do this stuff in an integrated and comprehensive fashion. And our third component is that we need to make sure that we're monitoring individuals effectively. We don't only want to hear from them when their symptoms become so critical that we have to deal with them in that reactive mode. If the only time that they're coming into care is when they are being brought in by an ambulance or by a police officer or by somebody else who's crisis response in their life, then we have a very little chance of making progressive steps forward. Because as we've talked about before, the person in crisis often presents very differently than they do most of the time. They're often less rational, less capable of playing an active role in telling you what their symptoms are and helping with their own self-care. So we want to begin in the shadow of this crisis to establish a relationship with people where there's some way of directly or indirectly monitoring them. Directly monitoring a person means that they are seen by their professional person to person, and this can happen either in a way that the individual comes in to see the clinician, or where there's somebody who's going out to interact with that individual, and sometimes there's a compromise. Now, many of the people that we're talking about who are cyclic consumers are not very effectual at going to their clinicians on a regular basis. So this monitoring often requires us to either reach out to the person or to meet them part way. For example, there are telepsychiatry and telephone psychiatry approaches where people come in to see their psychiatrist in the mental health office, but they don't actually travel to the psychiatrist's office. They're put on a video link and they speak to the psychiatrist that way. And they also interact with mental health workers and psychiatric nurses who are able to do some direct observation and communication with the patient. Some people are literally connecting up via their own computers at home or via telephone, and this can be a very practical thing because it's a way of connecting with the person no matter where they are. But we can also do indirect monitoring, whether it's a family, a friend, a neighbor, a landlord, or somebody who's in a paid capacity like an educational assistant or a teacher even in a school who manages to be in contact with other professionals. Now, once again, we need to make sure that we address confidentiality rules in doing this, and that's usually accomplished simply by having the individual sign a release, or if it's somebody who's under 19, by having their family sign a release that allows the professionals to speak to one another. And of course, if the person isn't prepared to sign a release, Another variation on this is for us to go with that individual and help them make a contact. Something as simple as sending an email to their clinician is something that I've done with people. And there's times when I have had to go out with somebody and spend an hour with them having coffee or going for a walk just so that we could take my smartphone out and put together a 5-minute email that we could send to that clinician. And I literally had the patient help craft the words and send the email so that it was clear that it came from them and it was in their words. Therefore, the psychiatrist or psychologist or counselor got a more accurate picture of what that individual was saying. And there is no limit to the creativity with which we can do this. We can have a person journal online in a blog. We can have a person videotape themselves and send it that way by text message with a video attached. Nowadays, with technology being where it is, we can really afford to be very creative at very low cost and still maintain people's confidentiality with the use of technology. There's an article that I'll put up that has a link here to mental health best practices. It describes in more detail the integrated treatment approach and a number of other exceptionally brilliant practices, and it's very much worth a read. So, think of ourselves like an umbrella with all of the various spines reaching out. What makes us integrated, what makes us an umbrella, is not those spines, but the fabric that connects each of those spines, the connectedness of each of those structures. And we need to be the same way. Otherwise, we're going to be very ineffectual in helping an individual in exactly the same way as an umbrella with only one spine on it or with multiple spines but no connections is not going to do any work. Now this slide is a review slide. It's from the last module, so we won't spend much time on it. But what I want to simply point out, is that there is a community-based team approach that we can take. And we can have this team set up for any type of repeat consumer. There is no set structure. It should be personalized to the individual. But we want as much as possible to involve that consumer, particularly in times when that individual is in a stable, lucid state, not just when they're in crisis. We want to have that individual being involved as much as possible in active consultation, asking them open-ended questions such as how can we help you or what approach might work in this scenario. But at first we have to be prepared to have that person perhaps play a more of a yes or no role. In other words, at first they may strictly be involved more in a signing off capacity, but may evolve as they feel ready and prepared to do that in giving you more of a self-directed perspective on how you might help support that individual. We should have their family involved if possible, and if there's a community care provider like a foster parent, a home share, which is similar to a foster parent, a group home, even somebody who is their spouse or their children in some cases. We're talking mostly about youth or adult children. But if we can have people who are willing and able to play even a small role in this community-based team, we should. It might be just that they are a conduit of information back and forth between the consumer and others, but that's a very valuable role. If an individual is in the school system, establishing that connection is valuable. Having one point person in particular makes a big difference. A social worker, if the person is supported by the Ministry for Children and Family Development, or by Community Living BC, or by a First Nations child and family organization, is also an exceptionally important person to have involved. Social workers, as we talked about in the previous module, are there not so much to protect people, but to connect people and to make sure that they are connected up to various resources that may be helpful. They make referrals, they help to inform an individual, and they also can play that active role in helping to monitor an individual. If a person has a First Nations connection, then we can look to community elders. We can look and see whether or not there are First Nations social services offered by their band or any other number of resources that are in their band office. And it is very much worth contacting their band office to find out what services are available. Now, I focused here on First Nations people, but there may be people from other cultural groups who also may have some connection. And this includes people who are going into the local Christian community churches, because in many of these churches there are things like youth groups or youth pastors, just to name a few people who might be of help. There are also people who do volunteers and members of the congregation who reach out to sick people. And it can sometimes be an interesting thing to talk to people who are used to going out and visiting folks who might be struggling with cancer or with diabetes or with something like a stroke. and have them start to countenance the idea that they can take that same type of approach with an individual who's struggling with dementia or schizophrenia or depression, and come and spend some time with that person in a way that is physically supportive and also spiritually and socially supportive. Of course, the medical clinician and even a person from the local emergency department may be somebody that you want on this team. Now, before people rear back and say, I don't have the time to do that, we're going to get you to think about that. We're not suggesting that that emergency department physician needs to spend a lot of extra time here at all. Just that we would, for example, come up with a crisis response plan for an individual, anticipating, for example, that they might have future occurrences and reasons to go there, and just getting that emergency department representative, that doctor or whomever it might be, to keep a copy of that plan on file, or take a look at that copy of that plan and say whether or not in their view it's realistic and fits well with the model of care at that particular hospital. If the person is seeing a medical clinician on a regular basis, we want to involve that medical clinician, whether it's a psychiatrist or even their family doctor. And as we've talked about in the previous module, getting that person's pharmacist involved, or having a set pharmacist, is also a brilliant idea. And policing. Here in Mission, we use that beat cop approach I spoke of earlier in another module, where we have individual police officers who are specifically overseeing particular regions of our community. That doesn't mean that they're the only police officer responsible for that region, but it is that they are a point of contact. They become the experts in that area, and they describe to others on the various watches what sorts of things might be happening in a particular community. And so, for example, I live in a neighborhood where right now one of my neighbors has a child who's struggling with drug addiction, and she knows that the child has recently really fallen off the wagon, to use her words. And it's a circumstance where, for example, I have had the police come out and actually chat with an individual before they engaged in crisis behavior. And they didn't do this in this case, and the child has ended up causing a great deal of conflict for himself because he went around the neighborhood and stole things from people before his mother found out and then returned everything and involved the police. So we want to try and involve that police officer in a proactive way. And if the school that your child attends or that the individual attends has a youth liaison worker, they're also an apt resource in this way. So this is just a quick refresher as to who we might see on the community-based team. But we want to remember to have that integrated and inclusive approach. Integration means that the team members work together. It's a collaborative approach, not just an informative approach. It's not enough to just send people information saying, here's what we're doing. That's part of the process, but not all of it. And it requires some kind of framework. For example, we need to have a simple agreement that we're going to connect in a particular way. Are we going to use email? Are we going to meet in person at a particular frequency? Are we going to combine those techniques so that one person who's particularly busy might be the emailer while others attend an actual meeting? And when we do this, what's our agenda going to look like? Are we going to actually sit and talk about things in a particular order? And I would strongly recommend that we do maintain a simple agenda, something that sounds like what has been happening and what are our goals for the coming few months? What do we need to address right now that's urgent? So those 3 questions would particularly be useful on an agenda. And again, those 3 questions were, what has been happening? What are our goals for the next period of time, and is there anything that requires our urgent attention? Now, this requires there to be a facilitator. The facilitator isn't necessarily the person that does the most work. They aren't necessarily the person that is the most connected to the individual. What they are is a person for whom it fits well in their job description to be a connecting influence, to remind people about meetings, or to send email out to people, or to telephone people and check in if they haven't heard from them in a while. So this person's really all about making sure that this group stays connected. This group needs to have a monitoring and follow-up approach. And this is one of the things that distinguishes us from that crisis intervention team. We don't just get together in the shadow of a crisis. We want to get together on a periodic basis to anticipate issues, celebrate progress, and keep things moving forward. We also want to make sure that we're identifying gaps and cracks and filling those up. If we notice that something has evolved, for example, if an individual has an emerging issue with their apartment dwelling and there's a complaint from a next door neighbor, we haven't really maybe thought about how to deal with that in the past. In this circumstance, we want to think about who might go and speak to that person, who might speak to the landlord, what role might be there. And as we said, it's all about keeping track not only of the individual, but keeping track of progress so that this group of people doesn't start to feel foundering and lost. They want to actually enjoy the fact and be proud of the fact and include the individual in the fact that the person is making progress. And the team must be inclusive. It must involve the consumer from the very beginning and throughout. The consumer will play a role in leading his or her own care. So in the pre-test, you're asked, is it important for that consumer to play a role in their care? And the answer is yes. And you might be surprised to find out that when I have worked with people, I have always expected a great deal of them as one of their support people. Now, I don't expect from them that they're going to necessarily give more than I do in all cases, or that they often have a lot to give. But I expect them to give what they can. And I say to people that if they aren't prepared to do that, there's very little that others can do for them. So we actually help an individual by having them have fair, reasonable, but significant expectations of them playing an active role in their own self-care. And this means that they have to sometimes be prepared to tackle some of the things that worry them, some of the things they're afraid of, with our support. We need to be understanding of the fact that that nervousness or fear is there, but we aren't going to simply say, well, if you're afraid, we're simply not going to do something. We might put it off. We might start someplace else for the time being, but we want to say to people a different message than, okay, we're not going to do that. Instead, our message might be something like, okay, well, let's start here and work our way up to that. Let's do a little bit at a time. And it's important that we also involve people that are trusted and valued by that consumer. So one of the very first things we want to do is ask that consumer, who do you think would be a good person to have in your team? And sometimes you might be surprised by the answers they give you. They might suggest that it's a person that is somebody who works at a business that they regularly frequent. And there have been times when this has happened with me where I was kind of embarrassed to go in and ask a bank teller whether or not they wanted to play a role in somebody's support team. But much to my surprise, that bank teller or the pub waitress or whomever it was said, yes, I actually can help out. I really like so-and-so. He's a sweetheart. He comes in here every day, and I'd like to kind of be a helper to him. So it's worth asking, because sometimes we make these connections in unorthodox but very valuable ways. It's also about connecting the consumer to formal and informal resources. So we need a person who's going to play the role of liaison. This is different than the facilitator. Again, the facilitator is our organizer, our connector of all the different spokes of the umbrella. The liaison is the person who makes sure that there is no disconnect between everybody on that support team and the individual that's being covered by that support team. So if the facilitator is the hub of all the spokes, the liaison is the handle between the umbrella and the consumer. They make sure that that consumer never gets so far away from the team that that team isn't able to actually help them. So what does that look like? Well, this is a person who might go out and do a little bit of informal outreach. And if they already are in the individual's life this way, and perhaps they're a mother or a child or a spouse or a neighbor or a best friend or a girlfriend, then they are probably already well suited to do that. But if there isn't somebody who's doing that, then we need to find somebody who's willing. And it can sometimes be more than one person, as long as everybody is coordinated and isn't saying, well, I thought you were the one who was going to go and see Joe this week, and I thought you were the one who was going to do it. So we need to make sure that we identify one or maybe sometimes two or three people whose job it is to go and connect with this individual, find out what their needs are, find out what's happening, and convey it to the rest of the group, and also to convey what the group is doing to that individual. Because there are times when that individual simply will not want to come in from the cold, so to speak, to deal with the others on their support team. This does not mean that the person is not working on improving their care, and it does not mean that the rest of us should absolve ourselves of involvement. As long as that person is staying connected in some way, as long as there's some evidence that what we're doing is getting through to them and is gradually causing that trend toward improvement, then that's an approach that we should continue to support. What it's really important for us to understand is that the involvement or inclusion in this team is not meant to just be a token experience. It must be a meaningful experience that allows the individual to have real choices and definitely affecting their dignity in a positive way. You may think it's difficult to do this, and sometimes it is, because the whole team of professionals and family may be sitting around knowing that something is going to work for an individual. But if they flat out say they don't want to do it, and we force it upon them, then we're simply going to never be effective with that individual. Why? Well, because they won't buy in. They'll stop being connected to you. They will start looking for ways to oppose what you're doing because they just won't feel like you have their best interest at heart. Now, you and I may know that we do, but if we stop and we think about it, we can probably relate to the idea that when individuals do things to us instead of with us, we often find it difficult to understand that they're doing things for us. So we have to make sure that we're doing the thing with the person, and if initially they don't want to take on something that we're suggesting, my answer to that is normally okay. And that is followed up by another question: what can we do? Going back to the comment I made about the individual having to play some role in their own self-care, what I say to my consumers is, all right, we don't have to do that, but what are we going to do? Because we do have to do something. The one thing that's not on the table is for us to just accept the things as they are. And it might be that we start more gradually than we might ever have imagined, but as long as we're doing something somewhat progressive, then that to me constitutes a process that's trending to the future. So as we said, that facilitator need not be an expert. They basically are the chair of this process. They ensure that there's regular and meaningful communication between the parties, and again, we can use technology in any of its forms to do that, from telephone to text messages to email to video conferencing or Skype, any combination of these things, and of course it can also be in person. And they need to think about setting times and dates that suit all people, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all people sit in the room at the same time nowadays. If you have something as simple as an iPhone, you can conference call now for absolutely nothing at the exact same time as you're meeting with a group of people in your room. So you can have that other party be sitting in their police car or in a small room in the emergency department and spend 5 to 10 minutes with you on a phone as part of that meeting and get back to their regular duties. We, as we said, need that liaison. That person is the one that keeps the consumer connected. It should be based on their relationship and comfort level, not on their expertise. So we said that this facilitator is somebody who need not necessarily know the community, know the client the best. They're a person who's going to really be well situated to be the facilitator. But the liaison is somebody who has the best relationship with the individual, not necessarily the most skilled professional. So we are asked a question in the pretest, what's more important, skill or relationship? And in this particular role, relationship is the one that matters. As we said, these contacts can be very brief. They don't need to necessarily be extensive, but we can have lots of little ones. They're often best to happen in what I call the parallel format. In other words, if we go and we say with the person, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation about your progress and about your mental health, for many people that will be intimidating and an unwelcome experience. They'll sit down with you and they will have very little to say. But if you were to say to that person, let's go for a walk through Heritage Park, or let's go get a coffee, or let's go get a bowl of soup, or let's go throw a frisbee, even though the activity doesn't sound like it's leading to a conversation, often while you're walking beside this person or doing an activity beside this person, small but very valuable conversations will be generated. And again, it's not about how long we talk with the person, but about the value or quality of that conversation. So there are times when I work with individuals where we spend an hour, but we actually spend about only 5 minutes of that in actual conversation. And that's exactly the strategy I intend to employ. It's on the way to the park in my car and on the way back from the park in my car that we'll have those conversations. And there are times that I've done that when I get to the person's apartment and want to drop them off. the conversation continues in the idling car for another 5 or 10 minutes just because that has worked well for that individual. And as we said, those contacts can also be very informal. So you could make a habit, for example, of going to get a coffee at a place that you know you're very likely to run into an individual. You're not going to run into them perhaps every day, but you know just based on past experience that you're going to see them once every week or so if you drop by this place regularly. And that can be an effective strategy. The liaison can arrange direct interaction or act as an indirect connector. So sometimes, and this happened recently where I had an individual say to me, I have a person who wants to connect up with somebody, but they don't want to deal with mental health. What can I do? And what I said is, spend some time with that individual just engaging in an informal social relationship. They want to come by once a week and have a coffee with you for a half an hour. Start with that and take as long as that takes. And after a while, as you get to know the person, have a sense of their comfort level, perhaps you can introduce them to the person that works in your neighborhood from mental health. This is an individual that the first caller knew. And we can simply say, hey, would you like to meet this individual? And it's not going to be anything more than a quick handshake. That little bit of exposure can sometimes get the ball rolling on that person taking the next step. And it might be necessary for that person to have that incidental exposure more than one time. And as we said, if a person is having difficulty getting in contact with their team, it may be necessary to have them give a written release to allow the information they give to one liaison person to be spread on that behalf to others on the community-based team. And it's a simple matter of writing something out, identifying the names of the people who are going to hear that information, and having the person initial it and date it. It's not more sophisticated than that. So let's do another journal entry. Could you be a part of a team? And if so, what role could you play? How much time and energy would be involved for you?